I arrived almost 2 years ago to take over the center. We changed our motto a little bit. It used to be insights, analysis of America, insights. For Australia, we've added solutions for the alliance. So in the work we're doing, we're trying to make it actionable. People may not agree, but give options that policymakers, parliamentarians, not just in Australia, by the way, but Japan, Korea, friends and partners can consider. Pete and John and Hayley and Jared and I have a new rule, which is don't put out a think tank report that says spend more, do more, try harder, pay more attention. Give people in parliament and governments and business options. So it's in that spirit we want to talk about the US election. It's going to be very close. As the famous baseball player Yogi Berra said, prediction's difficult, especially about the future. But it's going to be close. That's a pretty safe prediction. And it's wise to prepare and think through either outcome. This Blue Book, Red Book is a tradition at the center that goes back several election cycles. There's interest in Australia. I am told that in 2016, when Australia had a national election, that downloads of news on the US presidential election in Australia were twice as high as downloads of news about the Australian election. So there's obviously huge interest in Australia about American politics. My wife and kids and I are stunned to find Uber drivers and people in cafes who can sort of talk about swing states and which county in Michigan. It's quite impressive. In putting together this year's Red Book, Blue Book, I also had a bit of an epiphany. I came here from 15 years at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd worked, before going into the White House, I'd worked at the Council on Foreign Relations, so some of the big think tanks in the US. And it occurred to me, the think tanks in the US do not do this. You will not find Brookings or CSIS or Carnegie or CFR doing this kind of analysis of what a Republican or Democratic administration might do and what to do about it. There are a lot of reasons why. Frankly, one is the think tanks try to remain nonpartisan, but within the think tank ranks, people work on campaigns. I worked on McCain and Romney and Jeb Bush, and so it's very hard to get away from that. Part of it is that the Washington think tank community is a little bit paralyzed by the politics. Frankly, I was in Washington in March. I went an entire week without talking about the election. I had to raise it. Nobody knew quite how to talk about it. Got back to Sydney as soon as I got in a cab at the airport. Who's going to win the election? So this is actually, I think, a really unique contribution by my colleagues, and credit to everyone, particularly Jared, for pulling it together, that we think will not be read in Australia, but in Japan and Canada and elsewhere. Australia has agency, not in the election, not in the election itself. In 2004, when I was in the Bush White House, the Guardian newspaper thought it would be a good idea to urge their readers to write the good citizens of one county in Ohio that was famously on the fence between Bush and John Kerry, to urge them to vote for Kerry. And turnout for Bush went way up. So there's no agency in the actual election. We know Putin tries. We can talk about how much that matters. But I can tell you, having been on campaigns and in transitions, that Australia has almost unparalleled agency and access as campaigns and the governments are trying to figure out what to do, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but on issues like trade and climate. Doesn't mean that the Australian embassy in Washington gets to decide, but we'll always get a hearing. And in my view, in a unique category with probably Britain and Japan, across the whole range of issues from defense to trade to technology. So it's important to think ahead of time about what's at stake, what's being debated, what's, as John McCain, the pilot, used to say, what's ground noise and what's real. There's a lot of noise in campaigns. It's important in my view that it not just be on Kevin Rudd in the embassy, which is excellent, but on parliamentarians, on think tankers, on business. The US political and especially policy process is a great big scrum. Agile allies will get in there. and won't be alone, by the way. Japan in particular, and others will be in there as well. So it's with that spirit that we've put together this report and this panel. I often feel like I have to apologize for the U.S. at this point, but look, it is what it is. One of my favorite lines from the Reagan years came when the NATO foreign ministers in Europe and from Europe and Canada were meeting before their first meeting with the Reagan administration, and all the Canadian and European foreign ministers were whinging about the U.S. and the British foreign secretary apparently said, "Yes, yes, yes, the Americans are all the things you say, but they're the only Americans we have." So I think it's a wise government that approaches this with that sort of practical view, with a real sense of self-interest, with an understanding of the debates and who's on side and who might not be and who might be convinced. And I can tell you, whether it's a Trump or Biden transition, Australia's standing is so good in Washington, people will welcome it. It has to be done privately, often, but it would be welcome. Let me say just one more thing before I turn to the panel about the Red Book, Blue Book. Red Book obviously is a bit of forecasting of what a Trump administration might do. Blue, Biden. Jared will tell you that the longest parts of each chapter are the purple part, the part that doesn't change no matter who wins. It's an important thing to keep in mind. Donald Trump is probably the most disruptive president in American history. Began when he was in the outer boroughs of New York, fighting an insurgency campaign to get into the Manhattan real estate market using bombast, threats, bluster. As Melissa said, he's had more than 4,000 court cases, which is stunning when you think about it. Think of how many lawyers put their kids through college, thanks to Donald Trump. But that's his style. He's, in 2016, he told the New York Times he didn't care if Japan and Korea develop nuclear weapons. They're not paying their fair share. We'll pull troops out. There's a lot of that. And you know what? I think if you talk to senior people in the Abe government or the Morrison government, they'll tell you actually in very concrete ways, the alliance with the U.S. got stronger. Mark Twain, when he was asked about the music of Richard Wagner, said it wasn't as bad as it sounds. And that's a bit what it was like. Will it be like that next time if Donald Trump wins? You'll hear pundits say no, because you have the Heritage Foundation, the America First Institute now organizing to learn from their mistakes and deal with the deep state. And this is a common thing in American presidential campaigns for think tanks and pundits to claim that they're writing the script. And then usually the key positions, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, often Vice President, are people who are not screaming to the public how they're going to run the new government. And so I tell people, keep a close eye on, if it's a Trump administration, people in the U.S. Senate and Congress from Wall Street. When you're told there are no more Jim Mattises, there are no more sort of normal Republicans who would go into a Trump administration, it's just not true. But there will be very different views. From campaigning to governing in the U.S., it's about a 50% transition. About 50% of what you said you're going to do, you actually do. And there are big fights about that. I suspect if Donald Trump wins, there will be colossal fights about some key issues. But I worry least about U.S. alliances in Asia because the American public supports those alliances at the highest rate in many, many decades. Support in Congress for AUKUS is very, very broad. The only opposition that you've seen to AUKUS was not about providing Australia with this key technology. In our surveys and in other surveys, when Americans say are asked why do you support the alliance with Australia, with Japan, with Korea, the number one answer now, and this is new, the number one answer is because Australia, Japan make us safer in the U.S. It's logical to the American public that we would be supporting allies. The interruptions come when the defense budget in the U.S. isn't enough for the U.S. Navy to build its submarines. So you had a brief kerfuffle. It was all over the front pages of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian. There they go with the Americans again. But Congress put in $13 billion for the submarine industrial base. So my last quote on the U.S. attributed to Churchill, probably wasn't him. You can count on the Americans to do all the wrong things before they eventually do the right thing. but you do have to go in thinking about what you want that to be. So you all know Peter Dean. He's the director of our Foreign Policy and Defense program, the key drafter of the DSR. He'll talk about Congress, AUKUS, defense. Hayley is the director of our economic security program, and we'll talk a bit about critical minerals, climate. Dr. John Kunkel is our senior economic, what do we call you? Senior international economic advisor. Yeah. Do we not do international?
We're not sending him overseas.
Yeah, that's true. That costs money. Senior economic advisor, veteran of the trade, of the Treasury and the Prime Minister's office on economic, statecraft, trade, and finance. And then Jared, in baseball, the fourth batter is always the strongest hitter because when the bases are loaded, that's the one who hits the home run. So Jared hopefully will be our cleanup batter and take us out. And then we'll open it up for some questions. So Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to mention a few things and not take up too much time. One of the things I did to delve into my history, I'm a student of American history. I've got a bunch of degrees in that. And when I got to postgraduate school at university, I actually wrote a thesis about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in the Vietnam War. And that was sort of a real passion I had about the way Congress operates and the way the US system is different to our parliamentary system and the power and agency that Congress has. So this year, when we sat down with Mike and the board to sort of craft out the agenda, what I wanted my team in particular to do was to focus in this presidential election year on what's going to happen in the Senate and what's going to happen in the House, because fundamentally that's also where the money comes from. So we know famously Donald Trump, as Mike said he's going to pull US troops out of the Korean Peninsula, and Congress responded to that by putting legislation in the NDAA in that particular period saying, well, you could do that as president, but we will not fund it as a Congress. So there will not be one single dollar that would be able to be used to move one single American servicemen or women off the peninsula. So we've launched a sort of Congress in Asia policy program. There's a specific chapter in this Red Book, Blue Book that looks at congressional Asia policy. And I just thought I'd highlight a couple of things out of that. So one of the things I've noticed from our troops, but also if you look at the legislative record that's happening in Congress, in a very divided US body politic, one of the things they can absolutely agree on is strategic competition with China. In fact, as an Australian and member of the US Alliance Network, the one thing that probably worries me is will the Democrats and Republicans get into a fight to out-China each other? Because they actually agree on it. They see that it's getting strong support, particularly from the business community. When I was living back in the United States during the Obama administration, one thing I noticed that the people who were leading on pushing back against China was the business community. That was about their intellectual property theft. It was their unfair business practices. The fact that they saw it as a clear playing field. And in fact, there's a particularly famous group of very senior American business people that came together during the Trump administration to lobby about the introductions of tariffs and other measures to try and level that playing field out. So congressional Asia policy, I think, is a really important element to it. So that sort of definition of they agree on that. Now, we've seen disagreements around Ukraine. We've seen disagreements around other things. But I think it's starting interesting as we get closer to the election. We know there has been aid to Ukraine has been passed. We know, for instance, that Marjorie Taylor Greene put up a proposal to get rid of the Speaker again, and it was basically shouted down by both sides of politics over the Ukraine bill that she attempted to do. And that was done with the sort of nod and support from Donald Trump, who gave permission for Republicans to support that particular bill. As I said, but they're really formed and allied around the notion of strategic competition with China. And if you look at that part of the book, there's an interesting chart about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and comparing that to on page 13, in table 1 there, you can see that what the Indo-PACOM, so the Indo-Pacific Command in the US, have requested for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, what the presidential budget request was, but in the end, what the NDAA actually passed. If you look at, say, 2023, Indo-PACOM commander asked for $9 billion. The president said you can have $6, and Congress gave him $11.5 billion. So you can see the level of congressional support about funding these types of initiatives, about ensuring that what's happening in Asia is a really key focus. So I think not only is that something that we should watch, but when it comes to Australian activities and engagement, it is that level of activity engagement with Congress as much as with the executive branch of government. Now, one of the things I know we have a massive value add and advantage in Washington DC is for a very long time with a very bipartisan consensus, our embassy is staffed with a big congressional engagement office. I've known a number of our ambassadors over there, and on both sides of policies, they are massively active in engaging with the congressional leadership. That's worked for us in the past, and I think if Donald Trump was elected, that's going to be an absolute bulwark for us going into the future. But the thing to also watch is there is an unexpectedly high number of congressmen and women who are deciding not to rerun this time, including some really senior people involved in both the Senate Armed Services and House Armed Services Committee, and the same with the Senate Foreign Relations and House Foreign Relations Committee. So as those new sort of cohort of parliamentarians come into, or congressmen and women come into the US system, I think we've got to really ensure that we actively engage with them, get them to understand the importance of AUKUS, get them to really understand the importance of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative on what's happening in our region. We've been successful there, but it's almost like, don't say work harder and do more, but I think this is one of the things that we've got a great infrastructure in our embassy and in our system set up for that. And I'll also say that responds to the amount of congressional delegations and staffing delegations that we're getting through our centre and that coming out and visiting here. There's high interest in Australia. There's high engagement in what we can offer and our partnership, and I think that's going to be really critical.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Pete, and it's great to be here. After this morning, you may or may not remember certain things that we say as a panel, but you'll have the red book, blue book to take back with you, and it's really my hope that come election time, whoever wins the election in November, you'll go straight to this book as a resource, turn to the chapter that you're looking for information on, and find it basically like a Bible. The chapter on trade in the book was written by John and I, and rather than steal his thunder, he's going to talk about trade and I think industrial policy. I'm just going to give a quick burst on how the two candidates differ on climate change and the critical minerals piece. So I think it's important just to reflect on the fact that regardless of who wins, the United States is in a period of massive transition. We are all in this period of massive transition, and it's being expedited by US industrial policy in the Inflation Reduction Act. And both candidates, I think, will continue the US trajectory of moving towards renewables, but the election itself will determine how fast. How fast will that transition happen? Under Biden, it's going to happen a lot faster because he's more ambitious and frankly, he's more aggressive in terms of his climate change reduction targets and also the amount of money that he wants to spend to transition the US economy. Under Trump, it will be slower and the rhetoric is very different. So Biden obviously has used climate change as a signature policy of his administration, and he's put billions and billions of dollars into electric vehicles, batteries, wind, solar. Trump is very different, and sometimes I often think he's just trying to make himself a more obvious candidate for the other side, because he said that he doesn't believe in climate change. He says that he thinks the world's climate will actually start to get cooler. And he's also very vocally against things like wind-generated power. He said things that like they are really upsetting the whales and even causing cancer. And he's appealing to conservatives in conservative states like Texas who really think that the climate change agenda is a woke agenda. So I think you'll see substantive differences in terms of how the two candidates talk about climate change, and also on the issue of critical minerals. So critical minerals underpin all of these clean energy technologies. And the candidates are different in the sense that Biden likes critical minerals because they're good for the clean energy transition as well as defence applications and also new technologies. Trump likes critical minerals for their defence and security aspects and for their ability to underpin things like advanced semiconductors and other chips that go into all of our electronic devices and military jets, that sort of thing. So For an Australian perspective, when we're talking about critical minerals, the US is committed under its Defence Production Act to treat Australia like a domestic source of critical minerals. That puts Australia in the same category as the US, Canada, and the UK. And under Biden, Australia will get investment not to open new mines for critical minerals, because the Defence Production Act doesn't allow that, but for some of the downstream refinement of those critical minerals. And that's really important to both Trump and Biden, because at present, China dominates the production of critical minerals and also rare earth elements. China dominates the supply of things like, or the production of lithium, things like gallium, germanium, and it's really dominating that space. And both candidates in the US want to take back some of that market share and do it domestically, but they want to do it for different reasons. So Trump really emphasised the defence and security aspects of that. In terms of how much Trump could roll back some of what Biden has done in the climate change and critical mineral space, it is difficult to say, because often he will have a lot of bluster but then not actually follow through with some of his statements. So, for example, under the Inflation Reduction Act, there's been $145 billion worth of direct investment, and $60 billion of that has been announced, but only $4 billion has actually been committed. So not a lot of money has yet gone out the door. And one of the ways that Trump could roll back some of that policy is by downgrading some of the tax credit benefits for things like electric vehicles. Trump is also getting a lot of his advice from a Republican, Gary Palmer, and that Republican is talking about how EVs are not the future. He doesn't believe in EVs. So Trump will be focused on other things, and I think that's important for an Australian context, because there is opportunity in US industrial policy, and it's just a matter of how we market it depending on which president we have. So I think I'll
Excellent.
leave the comments there.
Thanks, Hayley. John?
Thanks, Mike. So look, I'll pick up on that and try to roll together a bit of trade and industrial policy. There'll be a fair bit of continuity in certain areas, I think. I mean, if you look at the broad goals, there is now a sort of a core of about 20 Republicans, I think, in the Senate who voted for Biden's industrial policy, the key things around certainly the Chips and Science Act, for example. So the three big goals are sort of reshoring manufacturing, de-risking supply chains, and essentially reducing, in some areas, economic interdependence with China. So that will be broad goals of continuity. The other point I'd probably make at the outset is, as Pete said, this overarching strategic competition frame is really what we need to take account of. So there's lots of stuff happening in terms of government intervention that, frankly, as a free trade economist trained at the ANU, I don't particularly like, but we are in a different world. And that world is one that Australia is having to adapt to as well, of strategic competition, but also weaponised interdependence. And in a sense, we saw that with China through the whole economic coercion phase. So we're having to adapt our thinking. In the same way, I think it was the international relations theorist Hans Morgenthau had this concept of strategic narcissism, that we can sort of pretend that everything good or bad that happens in the world is because America's done something. No. We've all got agency. We've all got elements of reacting to the same forces. And you know, if you take something like the Future Made in Australia Act, it's all part of this bigger shift over about a decade of governments having to lean in for a range of reasons, for strategic competition reasons. You look at the Europeans, their desire for strategic autonomy. So that, you know, we're all sort of swimming in this same big intellectual and strategic shift of thinking. In terms of trade, I mean, it's fair to say, I mean, Mike's probably I'm probably a little bit more on the pessimistic side of the spectrum. I mean, there's essentially two views about Trump. One is, you know, there's a lot of bluster. He doesn't really follow through. His bark is worse than his bite. We've just got to hunker down and get through it. And in a sense, that was sort of Trump Mark 1 for a lot of countries, and we got through it. The other view is this time they're serious. He's got a group of ideologues around him. Now, I think Mike's right in that the key will be the appointments in the national security space and in the economic treasury space, and that will temper some of the pure economic nationalism on the ground. But a lot will be up for grabs, and the Australian Embassy and others, it will be very important that we're plugged in across the system, as Pete said, in Congress as well, that we can sort of work with others. And here I'd give a really strong plug for us to work strongly with Japan in particular, but also Korea and the Europeans. We need to be intimately involved with how we manage this next phase in terms of whether it's Biden or Trump, because Biden's got, in a sense, as we've seen, the same sort of impulse on economic nationalism. It's more union driven, we know that. And, there could be a rough ride. I mean, Trump's talked about 10% tariffs on everyone, including allies. So I think there's a premium on other elements of what you might broadly call the global West, being able to find those parts of whatever administration to work with them cooperatively. Just banging on about the rules-based order won't cut it anymore. We need to have lots of solutions under the banner of economic security. I guess in that context, it's interesting, the government with their Future Made in Australia plan has the sort of two streams. There's the net zero element, and then there's the broad economic and national security element. I think we need to give a lot of thought to positive initiatives under that second stream. I'm not the biggest fan of industry policy, as we tend to call it. I think Paul Keating said, well, it's that, these people can't even fill out their travel forms and we want them to do industry policy. So we need to be realistic that we have very limited resources. We're not a reserve currency. We will have to be very wise about where we allocate that. I think we need to revisit things like the GUIO initiative on the defence front. We need to put some of our best and brightest minds on defence industry policy, and we can't shortchange that. And that will be, again, that will be the case whoever goes forward after the election. So it could be a rough ride on trade. I think, we're going to have to get our hands dirty on some of this industrial policy stuff, inevitably. And some of that will be around the world of alliance maintenance, and we've always had to do that. I worked for John Howard and worked for Scott Morrison, but in a while, in Howard's day, alliance maintenance was sending boys to Afghanistan. Now it's not that, but it'll be something else. So we're going to have to be prepared to make the trade-offs and commit the resources for alliance maintenance, but also work with other allies and partners to temper, frankly, when the Americans want to do some crazy stuff.
Quick product placement. John is helping us pull together a conference in Sydney, June 1920. It's a sitting week, I think, but we've got 5 secretaries of departments speaking, Stephen Kennedy and others, Jan Adams, and we have senior officials and former officials and prospective future officials from the EU, Japan, Korea, Singapore, India, Indonesia, and the US, including people just out of the Biden administration and people who are lining up with Trump to sort of get a big discussion going about the future of industrial policy, economic security, and de-risking. And I think the number of the speakers will be down here in Canberra as well. My optimism only comes from the hope that those affected by this crazy end of the spectrum trade proposals we're hearing will jump in like they did last time. So farmers, because if there's retaliation, for example, by China, it'll be against soybean farmers who are not unimportant in American politics, allies, and so forth. But it's going to be a scrum. It's not an area to be complacent. Jared.
Thanks, Mike. I'm the director of research here. The reason that Mike used baseball metaphors for me being fourth is that I actually covered in my time at the study center since I came 7 years ago, I've covered a wide range of issues. And in this publication, it's no less the case. I've covered China, the Middle East, as well as domestic policy, so all the lighthearted stuff. But the one thing that I do more than anything else is domestic politics and what Trump is going to do, what Biden's going to do, what's going to happen in the elections. And my comms team hates me for saying this, but it's the fact that the election doesn't matter. so much is actually going to continue no matter what, that if we focus our energy so much on the election, what is Trump going to do, what is Biden going to do, we actually lose track of the long-term structural things that are going to happen no matter what. So Mike flagged how I say the Purple Book is the longest aspect, the most significant aspect of this publication, and the lengthiest. And it's so true. If you look at where we have come, let's not forget when Biden was elected, we thought, maybe we as in the collective conventional wisdom, Biden was going to take a different stance on trade, maybe come back to the WTO. He's going to be a bit more, cool-headed about China. He was not going to, be doing the crazy manufacturing type stuff, incentives that Trump was doing. That's an old bygone era. Biden would be the internationalist and be focused on Europe. And how much things have not turned out that way, right? If you look at industry policy, if you look at trade policy, if you look at the way that allies are now being asked to do more than ever and are now more important than ever, and even Americans are admitting as much that they actually safeguard U.S. Security as well. What I like to tell folks in Canberra and Sydney is no matter what, I think we should prepare for Trump, because even if Biden wins, he'll be very happy with your preparations for a Trump administration. What does that look like? That means bolstering your ties with Japan, bolstering ties with friends and allies around the region, being prepared to work with many aspects of U.S. government, Congress, executive branch, state governments on trade and industrial policy, what that actually looks like. U.S. has carve-outs for Australia for critical minerals, but what does this actually look like in practice? There's a big Linus facility in Texas that got millions of dollars, and it was from the U.S. in the past year, and it has nothing to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the Defense Department wanting critical minerals. This stuff is going to happen no matter what. We can focus on a lot of the noise of the politics and focus on a lot of what's happening day to day, who gets appointed and who doesn't. But we know the broad trends going on. We know no matter what, it will not hurt Australia to double down on its relationship with Japan. It will not hurt for Australia to engage with more aspects of Congress. It will not hurt for Australia to understand that the U.S. doesn't want a long-term presence in the Middle East. There's all sorts of bipartisan consensus issues at hand here that I think it's fun to talk about politics. I love talking about politics. I'm happy to answer more questions about politics. But I think in terms of the structural things going on, that's what I think I really want folks to take away from this report, no matter what. That there are long-term structural issues at hand here that, in my view, helped Australia fare better than any other country in the world during the Trump administration. And I think made Australia all the same level of popularity in the Biden administration. There's a official state dinner for Australia during the Trump administration, and they only had 4 of them, and Australia got one of them. There's official state dinner during the Biden administration, and I don't know what protocol is on a second term for either candidate giving a second state dinner, but I wouldn't be surprised. The importance of Australia is paramount no matter what, who wins. So that's just the broad takeaways I wanted to touch on, but we wanted to quickly make our comments here and then take some questions so we can get into details.
Thank you, Jared. Home run. So floor's open. Welcome questions, observations. Andrew?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Question to Hayley and John, really. Sorry. And Andrew Hasty, question for Hayley and John. In the same way that Trump took a sledgehammer to the Paris Agreement, surely we can expect him to take a sledgehammer to net zero. And if so, surely that has consequences for the decarbonisation project in the United States and therefore the rest of the free world. Please discuss.
I'll have a quick go. I don't think that he will get rid of it. I think there will be like lambs to slaughter, things that he can get rid of. But I don't think that, even though he has talked a big game about it, I don't think he'll get rid of it. I think he will just slow it down. The reason I think that is because I think that he thinks that by talking about getting rid of it, he can win the election. But after he actually wins, he won't be that drastic. because there is already work underway, and regardless of what he does from a government point of view, industry is already moving in that way. And he does like a good deal, and things like the Inflation Reduction Act make the United States the centre of the world for the climate change transition. And I often think of the IRA like a planet, because it's 369 billion US dollars, which is more than 500 billion Australian, just for climate change initiatives. And so it's like a planet, and all of the other countries and industry are being attracted to this gravitational pull of the IRA. And Biden can't get all of the different tax incentives and long-term tax credits out the door before he leaves. But it's already changed the thinking of other countries in the world. And I think Trump will think he doesn't want to be behind. So once he's won the election, he doesn't need to win it again. And I don't think he will get rid of, all of the efforts towards net zero. I just think that he's using it as an election tactic.
Yeah, I probably think there's the international dimension and the domestic dimension. I think Hayley's potentially right on elements of the domestic dimension, that taking away things like tax credits is hard, and a lot of that money is already flowing into Republican states and districts. So he might, rip up something on EVs and slow down charging stations. So there might be a symbolic targeting of EVs, for example. I probably think, though, because he liked symbolism, the international dimension could be pulling out again. I mean, I think we need to be prepared for that. He probably, he won't have the same ambition as Biden in terms of net zero, in my view. So I think the international dimension and just the shock value, which he loves, could still play there. But then the domestic politics, we know the biggest solar just gone past California is Texas now. So a lot of this stuff is just modern capitalism as well. So, and if there's one thing Trump is, he's a capitalist, I guess. So I think there'll be elements that can temper how much he unpicks on the domestic front, but I wouldn't rule out him having the shock value of doing something internationally.
Andrew, I think the question's a very, very good one. Of the three pillars of the alliance that we now talk about, security, economics, and climate and energy transition, that third one is the least institutionalized, the least defined in a way, and the most vulnerable ideologically and politically in both countries, by the way. I mean, this is not an easy issue in Australian politics, I know. And I agree with what Hayley and John said. One parable, in the Bush administration, we went in, the Senate had voted 95 to 0 to not ratify the Kyoto Protocols. It was deeply unpopular in the US. And Al Gore was, in some ways, setting himself up because he was running on climate. The incoming Bush administration had a group of people in the Commerce Department and elsewhere who wanted a sort of pro-business, not Kyoto, but pro-business coalition of like-minded countries to start setting emission standards and things like that. It was all very prudent and all very smart, and there were lots of study groups. But the hardcore political people who had campaigned against Gore on this, before anybody was ready, got Vice President Cheney to announce we were leaving Kyoto before there was any plan, and it was a bit debilitating. So I could see something like that happening this time. And for U.S. industry, but also for Australia, for Japan and others, it is worth thinking, what does that climate and energy transition compact look like? I would emphasize the energy transition part and the critical minerals part, and not sort of, I think it would be a mistake for Australia to hold the line on the framing that was done for Biden, because the whole thing could just collapse. So start canvassing different parts of the Republican side about what would work, and I think you'd find some building blocks. EV would be the most vulnerable, but it can be done.
I'll just add one thing we're doing at the Space Center is actually working on a multi-stakeholder series of closed-door roundtables trying to build out this third pillar. What does it actually look like, regardless of who wins the election? And I think one thing to really highlight, we've heard maybe about the U.S.-Australia Climate Compact, the third pillar, as Mike said. A lot of people call it the Climate Compact, but the full name is actually the Australia-U.S. Climate, Critical Minerals, and Clean Energy Transformation Compact. And so it's not just climate, but also what I think is really important, this goes to my earlier remarks about what stays the same no matter what. What are the building blocks of this right now? It is building out supply chains, building out battery tech, building out critical minerals cooperation, and building out hydrogen cooperation. Why would the Trump administration be against this? Right? Like, there are substantive reasons for the Trump administration to be in favor of this sort of work, but if we only couch it as climate, net zero, that's probably not going to get as much buy-in from Trump administration. But if you talk about more tangible technology cooperation, I think there's some progress to be made. We wouldn't be doing our project if we didn't think there were progress to be made. And we're actually planning to launch our final report in January to build out sort of a menu of options for the new government.
Luke?
Thanks. Not to get down into the political weeds too much, but I've noticed that with Susie Wiles working with Trump, it seems to be a bit more disciplined. And are there views about only one person can have a certain influence a certain amount of time? Is that right, that she's having a good effect, and can we expect some more discipline from him as a president, or is it just a strategy to win some more moderate people in the States?
Well, Democrats will tell you that the Trump campaign is much more disciplined this time, but Donald Trump hasn't changed at all, and won't. So it's sort of a yes and no answer. And what Trump is doing so far, what the campaign is doing, is working. I mean, it's going to be very, very close. But this basically, I know a lot of Australians or people around the world will look at this and think the American people really likes what Donald Trump's selling. That's not the case. 70% plus of Americans don't like either candidate. And majorities of Americans don't really like what Donald Trump says and does. But when you peel back and look at the polls, it's the economy, stupid. Joe Biden he's not doing as well as Prime Minister Albanese. He's doing better than most of the other advanced democratic economies. Macron, Trudeau, Sunak, Kishida. I mean, inflation and voters are cranky. And a lot of these elections, I think this will happen in the UK, are going to be a referendum on the incumbent. And that's basically how this is shaping up. For Americans in polls, by about 20 to 30 points, the most important issue is the economy and inflation. And the polling suggests, fair or not, Donald Trump is seen as better at dealing with the economy. So the Trump campaign is more disciplined because they're basically just trying to keep that frame. And what the Biden administration or Biden team wants to do is make this a referendum on Trump. So that's why they wanted an early debate, because they want as much of Trump's greatest hits out there as possible to start defining him or really reminding Americans what they didn't like about him the first time. So it's a bit of a long answer, but there is more discipline in the Trump campaign, and the real skill is they understand that this is, like in a lot of elections, like in the UK soon, a referendum on the incumbent, which is not good for Biden. In the end, it'll be very, very close. Biden has some. If Biden wins Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and one district in Nebraska, he wins. And those are all very close right now. So it'll be close, but there is a discipline that you didn't have last time. Yeah.
I'll just say, I've become more and more convinced of my theory around this is Donald Trump cannot win. Joe Biden cannot win, but one of them's going to lose. Yep. And the way I say that is because what there are is Trump is trying to convince that element of the swing voters to vote against Joe Biden, not for him, but him by default because they're voting against Joe Biden. And Biden wants everyone to vote against Donald Trump to vote for him. They're not garnering enough of their own base and their own political support on their own thing. It's about the other guy. So we're going to get a double negative campaign. We're already seeing the double negative campaign. And it will come down to, I think, some base issues, as Mike says, around the economy and a few other things. Neither candidate is appealing. When 70% of the voters say they don't like either candidate and would prefer someone else to run, it's just too easy also for the campaigns to fall back on that as a political tactic. So it's going to be very ugly.
Probably just one quick thing, Luke. I think the debate will be interesting to see whether he's taking advice on that. If he behaves himself in the debate, then I think the discipline is clearly there that wasn't there last time. What's the definition of behave? Just doesn't go.
It's not in the
completely-
dictionary.
Yeah, just look like gets through it and doesn't blow himself up.
They also both agreed that mics would be shut off, so you will not get them talking over one another.
But there's a method to the madness as well, because what worries the Democratic strategist is if Joe Biden trips or falls once,
Do you mean
that's it. That's a
literally?
meme. Whereas Donald Trump, the
Yeah.
more crazy stuff he throws out, the harder it is for Democrats to. Which one do you rebut? Which one do you react to? So there is a certain, to your question, Luke, there is a certain method to the madness that the campaign advisors on Trump this time understand. In 2016, it was really just a collection of largely amateurs. Just, Trump's pollster told him he had a 30% chance of winning, and just the right things can. This time there is more to it.
Can I just very quickly
Yeah.
add? I think your question was maybe campaign having discipline. Will there be discipline in policymaking? I think in a campaign, your end goal is a lot clearer than in policymaking. So I don't see policymaking being significantly different and more disciplined. I see the campaign's a lot easier to be like, all right, here's our strategy. We've had years to prepare for this, and we only want, and our end goal is just winning this, right? What is the end goal with policymaking? It's a lot more amorphous. It's not as clear, and so I think it's not. I don't think this is indicative of him changing.
Why don't we take Melissa and Matt, because I think we're ending at 9, right, Jared? So we want to let people go exercise democracy.
Yeah. Thank you. My question's a little bit on where Andrew was going on net zero, but slightly different. Quite recently, one of our country's largest foundries was at risk of closing, producing steel that just energy prices are just out of control for them. And manufacturers, heavy industry manufacturers, are saying the same thing. So the risk for our sovereign manufacturing is real. So on the approach to net zero, I was keen to know how the US is dealing with this and whether it would be different under either administration.
Great, and we'll take Matthews and then wrap up. Yeah.
Sure. I just feel kind of morally obliged to ask you to talk about AUKUS. And we saw the recent meeting between Morrison and Trump, and we didn't get the exact details, but Scott Morrison suggested there were positive feelings there. I was wondering, beneath the top line issue of whether Trump does support AUKUS, what would be the more detailed, substantive things to be looking about whether a Republican administration would drive it forward and make it a success?
Well, let me start quickly on AUKUS. Donald Trump's whole MO is to be unpredictable. So even with Scott Morrison, he didn't say I'm 100% on AUKUS. He never does that. That's just how he works. The congressional support, and the Congress pays for it, is very broad. As I said, the only real interruption of significance was over the spending needed for the U.S. Industrial base for submarine production, which is now there. There's a bigger debate in the Republican ranks than there used to be on defense spending. But historically, defense stocks go up when Republicans win because defense spending goes up. So I think that piece of the equation is likely to actually be a bit easier under Trump administration. But the wrong comment by the wrong politician in Australia about Donald Trump, and he might get his back up, and then you're spending a lot of time trying to save AUKUS. So don't mess it up. I think all the trend lines are good. Yeah.
And just quickly,
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
On AUKUS, look, that seemed positive, and having Scott Morrison address that seems positive. If we look at the famous interview he did on where he responded to Kevin Rudd's comments, that was a pivot where the question was about AUKUS, and Trump clearly had no idea. So the pivot was, let's talk about Kevin Rudd, and he obviously had no idea who Kevin Rudd was either. I think a lot of it will come down to who he appoints as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, who he puts in the Pentagon. If you look very broadly about the people who are lining themselves up around that they are largely very supportive of AUKUS. I think what you'll do is in a Trump administration, the focus would stick on Pillar 1 of AUKUS and the submarines, and what will they do with that, and would they renegotiate that? If Biden's elected, it will be all, I think, about Pillar 2 as the optimal pathway is set. But the broad congressional support and the broad industrial support and the broad support of the Pentagon, I think would make it very difficult. The last thing I'll say is, if you look at what they've done in the Biden administration, they've now diffused a lot of AUKUS responsibilities across the Pentagon. There is not the sort of Abe, Denmark, and a couple of other really people. You can't come in and just remove 2 or 3 key people and the program shuts down. That is now diffused across the Pentagon system through the US Navy. It'd be much harder to extract anything about that out of the system now. It's really deeply embedded into the bureaucratic system.
Net zero?
Yeah, it's not Melissa's question. I guess it sort of comes down to this whole question that the West generally is trying to grapple with strategic competition with China, and that's the industrial base, the manufacturing base. So, I mean, the US has the benefit of being a reserve currency and can run a deficit of 6% of GDP. So they're obviously leaning into particularly semiconductors. They want to get to 20% of advanced semiconductor global production from basically zero. So there'll be, but your point around it is really, I guess, the ballast that the US has is on energy costs, largely because of the shale revolution. That still means that they've got, you know, really competitive energy costs. So I think that's the sort of, you know, that's part of what's obviously been a very challenging part of our domestic debate, is around what's our global commitment and how do we scare that with reliable, affordable energy. And I don't, you know, it's hard to say that we've covered ourselves in glory over the last 20 years on that here. So I think there's a real premium, though, again, on America's allies and partners working about, well, what are the parts of the industrial base that we need 10, 20 years from now? And what's Australia's contribution in that? What's Japan's contribution in that? So how are we working together to collectively rebuild something that we all know we're largely services economies. I mean, manufacturing is now, 5% of our employment. So we're coming off, you know, after basically 30 years of relative decline for all reasons we know about, but we've got to be very targeted with our resources as to what we're going to rebuild and by when. And in a world where workforce challenges are everything, that's a sort of big collective effort, I think, that we need to put in.
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks to Luke for hosting us. And I promise you, can't promise you we'll win, but I promise it'll be interesting. So stay tuned. Thanks.